What are the limitations of biblical argumentation in public discourse? When it comes to transgenderism, how might Christians be falling short in their efforts to challenge it? And what answers can be gleaned from philosophy and feminism? Those are the questions we'll be addressing on this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast from the Kirkwood Center. The Kirkwood Center is where we bring the best of Christian scholarship to the church to help equip the saints to engage with the culture. My name is Davis Green. I am the head producer for the Kirkwood Center. And with me, of course, is the president of the Kirkwood Center, Anthony Costello. Anthony, why don't we start out with a bit of your background for those who aren't familiar?
Yeah, well, thanks, Davis. I appreciate you being on here. And my name's Anthony Costello. And yeah, I'm a wannabe theologian, public theologian. Did studied theology at Talbot School of Theology here in Orange County, California, which is attached to Biola University. For those who have been watching the podcast world recently, Biola's been in the news for various reasons of late. We've also commented on those. But yeah, I grew up in Chicago, Roman Catholic family, Catholic grade school, high school, University of Notre Dame, did my undergraduate, went to grad school in Germany for a few years to study German literature. Didn't quite make it all the way through that program. Had a 14-year hiatus from academic work, did various things to include a 5.5-year stint in the U.S. Army with the 82nd Airborne Division and one deployment overseas. So I became a Christian, evangelical Christian, while in the Army. I had a born-again experience of Jesus, and after getting out of the Army, decided that I really wanted to get back to school and learn everything I could about my Christian faith, and got into apologetics, did an apologetics degree first, and then tacked on a master's in theology, and have been reading and writing and working ever since. So started the Kirkwood Center a couple years back with some colleagues from Talbot. And we are trying to do good public theology, I guess is the way we would put it.
Yeah, I think a mutual friend of ours, when I brought you up at one point, said you read more than anyone he knows. So you got that going for you.
Well, I've been granted the ability, the time to read at least during the week, not on the weekends. And I've tried to be disciplined in learning everything that I can that is relevant to the, being a good theologian and addressing the issues of the day as best I can. So I've been gifted with that opportunity. So
yeah, no, it's good, and this, the topic we're digging into today is kind of a prime example of that. Given that it kind of digs deeper than just the surface level conversation about it. But obviously, I know I mentioned the kind of questions we're answering before, exploring transgenderism in particular, but on a deeper level, looking at some of the philosophical roots behind it, the foundations that are there that most of the time is not really circulating in public discourse, certainly not in the political conversations about, how to handle it. Yeah, so for broader context, this discussion will be built around an article written by you, of course, titled Philosophical Foundations of a Transgender Worldview. I'm leaving sort of your subtitle out because that's, we'll get to those sections in a little bit, but
right.
We'll link to that in the show notes for those who want to read kind of the full version there. But yeah, first things first, do you want to just give us some kind of background on, why you wrote the article? What was kind of the impetus for that right now?
Yeah, so the article's up at Themelios, which some of the audience might be familiar with. That's the Gospel Coalition's journal, their academic journal, online journal for biblical and systematic theology. I was sitting at the Evangelical Theological Society Conference 2023. The keynote speaker for ETS that year was Abigail Favale, who is a Christian philosopher who teaches at the University of Notre Dame, which also happens to be my alma mater. It's not super relevant to this, but she was giving a very good talk on the issue of transgenderism and a particular kind of shift amongst transgender theorists, advocates on activists that was occurring that seemed to be a fairly significant shift away from previous theories of gender. Okay. And it struck me that while this shift was in one sense, and this just to say it straight out, it was a shift away from the idea of gender being a purely social construct to gender having something like an actual essence to it, an essentialist view of gender amongst transgender advocates, right? That gender is something real in the world, that it's not just something we create as an act of the mind or the will. So as I was sitting there, I was like, wow, this is really good. But then it started to strike me there were still other things that one would need to address from a Christian or biblical worldview that are sort of endemic in the culture. If we really wanted to attack the roots of what has given rise to transgender ideology and activism, right? Then there's a couple other things that are just sort of embedded in what, like Charles Taylor called the social imaginary of American cultural life, that still need to be redressed. And there are intellectual challenges out there, philosophical challenges that we as Christians still have to tackle. And if we don't, so there's intellectual work to be done here. And if we don't, it shouldn't surprise us in the future not to see not just a continuation of transgenderism, but even other kind of more aberrant and weird and strange and incoherent kinds of theories, and then the sort of activism in the political and legal realm that sort of happens because of those theories.
Yeah. And while we're kind of in the more narrow scope of Favale's work, at least as you kind of witnessed it, what do you want to talk a little bit more about that sort of paradox, and why that's relevant to the modern conversation? Because she ties a lot of modern transgender theory and just kind of broader ideology to feminism,
right?
But obviously there's some conflict there.
And I was working off of her talk, which she was kind enough to share with me. She sent me her notes via email when I asked that I wanted to write an article. She has a book out now. The talk eventually became a book, and the title of the book is in the article somewhere. I can't find it right now, but we'll link to it. But the paradox that Favale was pointing out that's occurring within gender theory or gender identity theory, GET, was that older views, not that old, but we're talking about like views that maybe start with feminist philosophers like Simone de Beauvoir, and then kind of culminate in the work of Judith Butler, are social construct theories of gender, right? That there's not really a biological given in the world that we can know. Rather, what we do is we construct identities that we then apply to phenomena in the world, right? Some of the phenomena in the world that we experience are things that we call men and women, right? What they actually are, and this, I try not to get too down into the weeds of going all the way back to like Kant and everything. We will get there, but basically, what it is we cannot really know what Kant called the noumena, right? The thing behind the phenomena of our experience. So we have sense experiences of the world, the phenomenal world. Okay. But what the mind, what's happening is what Kant what Kant did or said or argued was that the mind sort of constructs the phenomena of our sense experiences. Okay, so we kind of start with that sort of Kantian view of the mind constructing the phenomena of our sense experiences. And this, of course, was Kant's answer to Hume's skepticism about the external world, right? And so downstream from that is something like social construct theory. So Kant would say, or would have argued, that reason constructs this phenomena. But for Kant, this is very basic sort of construction of the phenomenal world. You know, the mind is active in imposing structure on the phenomena. So that could be very basic things like space, number, quantity, causality, which was a big one for him because he was trying to answer Hume's skepticism about cause and effect. But for Kant, this is sort of, even though it's subjective, the mind doing this, it's universal, right? It's universal to all people. Every mind does this, constructs the world in this particular sort of way. So we would have commonality amongst different minds, right? But over time, there are critiques then of Kant's idea that reason is universal and operates in this universal and formal way, right? So by the time you get to Nietzsche, this sort of idea of reason is itself downstream from the acts of the individual will, right? So what is more primary is the human will, and the will is actually constructing a reality that is sort of attuned with more basic desires, motivations, wants, drives, and so on and so forth, right? So basically what this is doing is it's getting to the idea that we construct the realities that we kind of want or desire to have. But of course, we're not just individual minds. We are many minds living together, right? So there's a construction of a social reality that we all sort of live in. Again, we don't know what actual reality is, but we are all these individual minds with desires, needs, wants, drives, and we're willfully sort of constructing through language the worlds that we want to sort of live in. Okay. And when you get to de Beauvoir and then Butler, one of the phenomena that in the world is sex or gender, right? And for these feminist theorists, these have been, there's nothing like a woman that is just a given in the world, right? That exists outside of the operation of the mind, imposing things onto this otherwise unknown reality. And this so it applies not just to very basic concepts like space and quantity and so on, but it applies to human beings as well now. All right. So human beings themselves are socially conditioned and conditioning types of things. Everything is a result of a social process. Okay. Now, a lot of this theoretical development was done prior to these feminist thinkers by Frankfurt School philosophers, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and so on, who developed this idea that everything was again, conditioned by the mind, right, over time, and that the mind itself had been conditioned. So human thinking has been conditioned over time in such a way that it becomes very difficult to even say that we think similarly to maybe the way people thought, in biblical times, right? because everything has been continually conditioned to include the mind that is doing the conditioning. All right. So, I mean, for someone like Butler, then, but to talk about biological givens, right, is itself sort of like a fool's errand, right? Really, what we're doing is we're constantly socially constructing, what we call women or what we call men. But these things can be changed, right? And what you get into then is a kind of competition amongst socially constructing minds to see who comes up with the more powerful or the more the more influential sort of fiction, social fiction, that we then apply to our the way we discourse about human beings. So that I said a lot there, but the main ideas would be that for these social construct theorists, there's no fixed reality, right? Everything sort of gets whittled down to or reduced down to the will of the individual mind and words and how we use words. Okay. So there's nothing like a nature, a male or a female nature, or an essence or a form that is out there, that is external to us, that we are trying to sort of grasp or understand, that we can discover things about. We're creating these realities, and they're mainly linguistic realities. And the reason we can create and recreate these identities over time in accordance with basically how we feel about it, right? What we sort of desire. So the whole thing there becomes a very just an inherently political project, because whoever sort of can dominate, I guess, the conversation about what gender is, basically sort of gets to say what gender is, right? Which was sort of Nietzsche's point. So now that was the earlier view, that gender is socially constructed all the way down, right? There's nothing there to actually talk about or to discover, nothing extramental in that sense. But what Favale was pointing out in her talk was transgender advocates and theorists are now sort of returning to a more essentialist or realist view of gender, that gender is not just purely constructed as an act of the mind, but instead that there is something, gender, it's real, it's reified, to use that kind of language, it's in the world, and that one has a gender, a male or a female gender. And the paradox here is that for these gender essentialists, the problem is no longer one of trying to change the narrative about socially constructed identities. The problem is that one has literally the wrong body. Okay, so one actually has a deep sense that gender is real, that I am a male, but let's just say, for sake of argument, I don't have a male body, right? So for these newer folks, or the newer, transgender folks, the problem is their deep experience of their actual gender doesn't match up with the body that they have. So something then has to be done to sort of fix that problem. So that's the paradox. It's not the socially constructed view of gender, where it's all sort of will and words. You can reduce it down to will and words. There's a sort of fiction that we're creating. And then it's like, whose fiction about gender is going to win out? versus gender's real. There is real sort of maleness and femaleness in the world, but we have people who have the wrong bodies. And then what are we going to do about this problem of somebody, to use the old phrase, being trapped in the wrong body?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, that's super helpful because, on one side, it shows that there has been a shift in that, and the point you kind of make in the article is that in a lot of ways for the average person, it's not a livable view really at the end of the day to hold those things as, like you said, the competing narratives. Like it's a much more difficult ideology to live out. The other piece, like why that distinction is helpful, is because it shows that, most people are not operating on that level of, philosophy and, history of how we define reality. It's a very, grounded experience of life that, there is a social influence piece to it for a lot of people that say somebody draws the conclusion that they're trapped in the wrong body, but it highlights that same kind of disconnect between the sort of abstract, philosophy of it and the grounded, reality that people are identifying for themselves, right?
Social constructivism is a very difficult philosophy to live by because we tend to just pre-theoretically, we live in a world where we think we know things, basic things, and that we have not constructed these things through a social or historical process. And one of those things that we run into every day that seems like a given of nature is that there are two kinds of persons, right? I mean, you call them male or female, you can call them X and Y, you can call them, Mutt and Jeff, whatever. I mean, any language, Mann und Frau, or species A and species B, but it's just, we don't really experience these things as socially constructed identities. We do take them at face value as biological givens or facts, right? So it takes a lot of activism. It takes a lot of aggressive, which we have seen. I mean, this is what we've seen over the last 5 years. It takes a lot of aggressive propagandizing to convince people that these things, these biological facts, are mental constructs, right? That they're basically like useful fictions, but that we can tell a different story. And then once that story gets told, everything will sort of align, not to any reality, but to this story, right? And that's what's been attempted. And again, it's inherently political because it's about society, and it's about a social narrative, right? That has to become predominant. And then what happens is, if you can get that narrative to become the dominant narrative, then you can tailor your laws and your governance to fit that new narrative, right? And and one of the reasons it can be compelling to some extent is because there are some things that are social realities, right? That we do create and impose on the world. There's 2 books that have very similar titles. One is by Peter Berger, the sociologist, called The Social Construction of Reality, The Social Construct of Reality, where he talks about this. He talks about how we create certain realities, right, that don't exist in nature. The other one is John Searle's book called The Construction of Social Reality, right? Take money, for instance. Money doesn't exist as a given in nature. Let's just think in terms of old-fashioned paper or coin money. It's like a dollar bill is a piece of paper, but we invest it with a certain value and it turns into money, right? That is a kind of socially constructed reality. You know, dollar bills used to have value. They don't have so much anymore, but you know, you get the picture, or the coins, you know, coins or whatever. So there are things that we sort of impose on natural objects and we treat them as if they have certain value and stuff. We talk about them in certain ways that they're not, right? Physically necessarily that way. There are other kinds of socially constructed realities that are around gender. I mean, blue for boys, pink for girls, you know, whatever. Even maybe clothing, dresses for girls and pants for boys. I mean, you could imagine a world where that was just switched around and nobody thought anything about it, right? Well, with clothing, it might relate to the biological given of how the body is shaped, of course. But I mean, there were kilts, you know, in Scotland that, you know, whatever. Okay. So we start to think, well, maybe, you know, there are some things that we do seem to just create because of culture, history, historical period and time and everything. But, you know, to go too far and think that everything is sort of so socially constructed all the way down, there are no givens of nature, right? That's where I think, you know, you're not to try and convince, you have to use the heavy-handed tactics that we've seen play out over the last several years to the point of, and let's say it, to the point of killing people if they disagree, right? That, you know, so that seems to be you know, from a bridge too far. So well, again, what Favale was pointing out in the talk and was in the book, now some transgender activists, theorists, transgender people are saying, well, okay, it's not that these things are totally socially constructed and everything's just sort of like linguistic fiction. Okay, there is something, a maleness, you know, or femaleness. And this is just for sake, we won't make a short out of this, but, you know, I feel like a woman, but this body's just obviously wrong. But what is primary is that deeper internal sense that I have. There is femaleness, and that's what I really am. So what am I going to do about this wrong body that I seem to be inhabiting? And that seems to be where at least some people are going now, which would return us to something like essences.
Yeah. Yeah, and it goes to show too, like you're saying earlier, that you know, what Abigail is advocating for is then a biblical model, but that doesn't necessarily cover the scope of what's behind those ideas, right? So,
or why we still are rejecting the biblical model, you know, because So in her talk, she offers what is opposed to the gender paradox. She offers the Genesis paradigm. Okay. And, you know, and she does a good job of saying, like, the given of biological sex is by design, right? Once we know who the author of gender is, God, not a blind evolutionary process, although I don't know where she stands on issues of like theistic evolution or whatever, however it may be. But when we know that our bodies have been designed by God, okay, with intent and purpose, right, then we can accept that this is this is something essential about humanity, right? That God has given us a certain kind of metaphysical status, right? Call it the imago Dei, being in the image and likeness of God. This is not something that can be constructed by us. It's given to us by our Creator, right? But part of that image of God, image and likeness of God, is that we are male and female. He didn't make just one kind of androgynous being, and but in the biblical story, God separates, right, Eve from Adam. Both still possess fully the imago Dei. So there's unity there in the essence of the imago Dei. But then the bodies, the differentiation of the body also matters. There's also something about the differentiation of the male and the female bodies that reflects the image and likeness of the Creator. Otherwise, God wouldn't have done that, right? He didn't need to create us that way. We could have been like some of these jellyfish that just sort of reproduce asexually, right? But differentiation of the bodies is integral to the plan and intentions of the designer. And that is not that there's a psychological component there. And then, of course, there's a teleological component there. We're supposed to come together and produce new image bearers, right? So she offers the biblical paradigm, which we're familiar. We're familiar with as Christians, and that this is a sort. And she talks about it in sacramental language. Of course, she is Catholic, but as Protestants, we accept too the sacredness and the sacramentalness of marriage, of the two becoming one flesh, right, for the creation of new life, right, of children. So that's the offer. That's the counter, where you on the biblical paradigm, you get the essence part. Hey, the essential part is there. But then you also get the origins part. Why is it there? Because it was given to us by God. And you also get the purposive part. What's it there for? It's there for union and procreation. Okay? Because otherwise you just have gender essentialism. But so I feel like a woman or I feel like a man. Okay, but like what is it all for? And how did it all come about? Gender essentialism, apart from the Genesis paradigm, doesn't answer origins or teleology, right? It just might say there's real maleness and real femaleness in the world. Okay, but what do we do with that then, right? If you adopt a kind of radical constructivism, I mean, look at one could then what is the Bible on that view? I mean, first of all, you got the broader question of what is truth on that view. Truth is not like I make a claim and then I test to see if that claim corresponds to an external reality. Truth, at most, on a constructivist view, is we create a story and we hope that it's coherent, internally coherent, so that we can live by it. But whether or not the story we've created, and there is an epistemic view called coherentism as opposed to correspondence theory, but we've constructed a coherent story, but whether or not that story has any bearing on reality or not, but if we accept the constructivist view of reality, right, which is we have really no access to the world as it is, right, and everything is just sort of the mind or minds creating stories so that we can sort of navigate around a world that is otherwise totally obscure to us. Well, then what is the biblical story? It's at best, it's maybe it's coherent, but whether or not it applies to reality, this already undercuts that, because everything that is claimed, every claim that is made is a construct. And if you're sort of in the line of Nietzsche and also sort of like Marx and Nietzsche and later folks like I'm trying to think of some of the other postmodernists, maybe Derrida and stuff. Every story or grand narrative that is constructed is downstream from something like the desire for power, right? So every story becomes, you have to be suspicious of what Paul Ricoeur called the hermeneutic of suspicion. You have to interpret as if it is nothing more than a power play, a play to get more power, privilege, pleasure, advantage, right? And whoever's got the best story, let the best story win. Let the best storyteller win, is sort of the eternal fight that's going on. So you get critical theory, critical race theory, critical gender theory. That's where that all plays in, because everybody is basically just constructing narratives for the sake of their own personal or their own group advantage. Okay, but we can't live like this, right? We can't live like this. So, but one of the things I point out in the article is, as much as Favale's Genesis paradigm is the answer, right, is the right answer to our gender and sex confusion, right? It's not really an answer in the sense that people don't know this intellectually. Like Simone de Beauvoir and Judith Butler, being fabulously, wonderfully educated women, I mean, they knew what the Bible said. I mean, they know the classical history of the Western philosophical and theological tradition. They've heard of Augustine and Aquinas. I mean, they're not dummies. It's not necessarily that they're like, oh, we didn't know this. Now that we know it, we have the answer to what gender and sexuality is. There's a rejection, right, of the Genesis paradigm. Now, I think Favale would say this probably, but I pointed out in the article that St. Paul is pretty clear in Romans 1:18-32 that it's not just an intellectual error that human beings make when they reject the obviousness of God in the world, or when they reject the givenness of the creation. It's not just an intellectual error, like, oh, we didn't know, or we were just, I mean, there are the noetic effects of sin. We can talk about that. But Paul's pretty clear. We subvert or suppress the truth in unrighteousness. That's a willful suppression of the truth. Now, it can be to the point of where we see our conscience is seared, and we make intellectual errors from that suppression of the truth and unrighteousness. But first and foremost, it's an act of the will to reject the givenness of the Creator, what the Creator has clearly presented to us through his creation. Right? So the Genesis paradigm is rejected on multiple levels, not just some abstract intellectual level. It's rejected out of, even if it's true, we don't like it. We don't want this to be the case, because we think to live with those constraints of the designer, a maleness, a femaleness, and the requisite given bodies of male and female that are obviously important, right? We're not just souls; we're ensouled bodies. Embodied souls. In our willful suppression of the truth, even if we were to recognize that, like that's kind of obviously true, we don't like it, because why? Because it puts constraints on us, and we don't want to be constrained by God's design.
Yeah, and it makes good theological discourse with people that disagree tricky, because at the heart of what the Christian is advocating for is something that is fundamentally incompatible with fallen man, right? So we're sort of advocating for something that can't be in many ways can't feel like common sense to us even. But then a lot of those conversations on the surface level will just boil down to, well, give me the best proof. Give me your explanation for why what the Bible is claiming to be true is true, or why it's a reliable source of truth. But
right.
Per your example in this article on the topic of transgenderism, you can only get so far in that surface level part of the conversation before you have to dig into, well, let's talk about why we're making those assumptions to begin with, and why we are at odds with this. Because it's the atheist versus creationist debate is not the place where you want to say, yeah, I really struggle with that too, and I don't really know. But there's some fundamental truth to that, in that we are all sort of struggling against this thing. It's more a question of how we got there and what's actually most compelling.
Right. Because one thing in all of this that we don't need to lose sight of is that there are people who feel like they are women or trapped in a man's body, or men trapped in a woman's body. I mean, there's been gender dysphoria since the day is old. Our explanation for that is the fall of man and the corruption of the world because of sin, right? Sin, not just morally, but there's sin has consequences for nature itself, right? Nature red in tooth and claw. We don't expect hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis in heaven or in the new creation. So there's a fallenness, not just of man, but also of his environment. And one consequence of that seems to be certainly something like gender dysphoria. The Bible, I mean, ancient people are not unaware of homosexual desires, people feeling like they're trapped, like they should be a woman when they have a man's body. I mean, that's in every mythological story. That's in all the the Greeks and the Roman historical narratives and mythologies. So we know that. So we know that's a real thing. But now it's probably maybe a newer thing to reject this rather obvious reality of there being two different kinds of bodies, and that is sort of like an established biological just fact.
Yeah. So, and then on that, you've obviously covered a lot of the ideas, but do you want to just kind of talk through the actual categories for the philosophy behind something like modern transgenderism? Obviously, a big part of the article was
and I feel
the kind of web of nominalism, utilitarianism, and pragmatism.
Yeah. So I first part of the article, I sort of lay out Favale's explication of the paradox between the gender constructivists and the gender essentialists, right? And I give a little background. I give her Genesis paradigm response, which is, again, the correct sort of response, but it's a response that is willfully rejected by both the constructivists and the essentialists. But so, and this may be where I got to go back a little bit and clarify some things that I said about like Kant and stuff. But the primary the philosophical difference between the gender constructivists and the gender essentialists, we could say, is the belief or acceptance of something like essences or universals, right? That there is something real, like call it, let's just take the human person, call it humanness. And all human beings share in the universal humanness, okay? Human nature, right? And every person is an example of humanness, a particular example of this universal or essence of humanness, Okay. The antithesis of this view, which we could also call realism about universals or realism about natures or essences, is that these things don't exist and there are only particular entities in the world. So there's you and I don't share in humanness, right? In the form of humanness. This sort of goes back to Plato's forms, which then the Platonic forms eventually, with the advent of Christian theology and Augustine they get sort of placed in the mind of God. The forms, Platonic forms, which are these eternal, immaterial, indestructible sort of more than real realities, right? Of which things of the sensible world are but examples of. These get construed as basically ideas in the mind of God. So God has an idea, humanness or humanity, right? That is the paradigm or the archetype. And then he makes actual humans. Okay. And human beings share in humanity. We have that essence in common. That would be the one view. The other view is that this is not a real thing. Humanity. I mean, you could also talk about objects like redness. Does redness as opposed to particular red things? Do particular red things share in the essence or the universal redness? Okay. William of Ockham and others before him, but kind of in the modern era, it starts with Ockham, says this just sort of unnecessarily populates our world with an infinite number of entities, right? Now, wouldn't be a problem because God being infinite being could have an infinite number of ideas. Okay, not a problem for God to have all of these archetypes in his mind. But Ockham thinks this is messy, and Ockham has good intentions in mind that we won't get into. It's a bridge too far. But he's trying to protect certain aspects or characteristics of God, especially God's omnipotence and God's freedom. But he sort of gets rid of the idea that universals actually exist. And what there are in the world is just their particular entities. And they have similarities. And then we create names for these entities that appear or look similarly. So there's not a human nature that you and I share in, or that this dog and that dog share in, call it dogginess, right? There's human looking individual 1, call him Tony. Human looking individual 2, call him Davis. Human looking individual 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many they have been. They all look very similarly, act maybe even similar in everything. But there's nothing real that they all share in. They're all just particular beings, right? And then we give these beings a name. We create a name, humans, and then we place them all in that category. Makes life easy, right? That's a pretty bare bones explanation of nominalism. But if there are no essences or universals that we all share in, then you could see how this eventually leads to sort of something like constructivist theory. There are no natural kinds or essences to things. What Plato and Aristotle both called, at least in our English translations, the form of a thing. For Aristotle, the formal cause. What makes the thing that it actually is? And if you lose the form, and we're just giving names to things that appear or look similarly, right? If you lose the form of the thing, the essence of the thing, you also lose what it's for. You lose what Aristotle called the final cause, its purpose or teleology, right? And now we can kind of see when you get sort of a robust nominalism, which certainly comes after Kant's critique that we can't know anything of the real world. We can only know the phenomena, and our minds are actually constructing the phenomena of our experiences. All right. well, then you start to get into this idea that there really are just names that we're calling things, but we really don't know what these things are. And then it's just who's calling which things what names, and how many of those people are calling it by this name and how many are giving it a different name. And again, we get into this battle of just naming things, but the names really don't refer to anything real, an essence of the thing itself. And without an essence, not only can we change the names, but we can also sort of talk about, we don't really know what the thing is for. We don't know what if there's no essence, we don't know what it's for. We don't know what its purpose is. So you start to get into sort of a radical subjectivism about what things are and then what they're for, right? What are human beings for? I don't know. So if we don't have anything like real essences or natures, we can kind of, to put it bluntly, we can kind of make up what we think we're for, And one of the obvious candidates throughout human history is that we are for pleasure. We are pleasure-seeking things, seems to be the case. So what we can do is try and construct society in such a way, since there are no real essences that we need to sort of take into account. There's no real end goals that are designed for us to sort of be fulfilled, right? For us to fulfill. Now we have to construct not just what we are, we have to construct what our purpose is. And again, it's a free-for-all, but one good candidate for that is constructing a reality where our purpose or end state is pleasure. Psychological or physical or both, usually both together, is pleasure. So, because again, it's just the idea together, there's no external reality or the way things are that we should be trying to assess or understand or grasp. And in grasping the way things are, maybe even aligning ourselves with the way they are or are meant to be. Okay. So it's kind of a free-for-all at the end of the day.
One, per your point on the sort of modern transgenderism that does want to accept essence within male and female, even taking that step out of there's a lot more objectivity to that view, but it's still just as easy for them to fully reject biblical paradigm.
Well, right. It's like, okay, we have something. We really feel like there's something like maleness.
Because they're appealing to some for whatever X number of reasons why they've drawn that conclusion about themselves. That is ultimately they're appealing to what feels best, what is most likely to make them feel happy.
Yeah.
Because as like the deciding factor, right?
If you don't have a designer, a transcendent God, right, who has the sort of view from above of what maleness and femaleness is and how they relate to the image and likeness of God, that ultimate ontological grounding, you can say, well, it seems like there really is something maleness or femaleness, that there's something essential about them. They really exist. But what more can you say than that? What do they relate to? What are they grounded in? Who tells us? You're going to wind up probably falling back into a constructivist view. Okay, well, tell me about what maleness is. Well, okay, this is what it is, and da, da, da. And look, I don't want to make this too simplistic. It's still a struggle for us. It's still going to be a struggle for us, although we know that, or we can say that we know that maleness and femaleness relate to the image of God, who is the ground of all being and the designer and creator of all things. That gives us a little bit more, but we still do have a process of then trying to figure out. And I don't know how many books have come out on like 7 examples of biblical manhood, John Piper's view, or 8 views on biblical womanhood, or what. So like we still got work to do. I'm not saying it's easy, right? But with nominalism, things really devolve very quickly into just, it's sort of whoever, you're just giving names to things, and you cannot say that there really is a way that we're supposed to be, because you cannot say what we are in any really significant sense.
Kind of descending out of that, utilitarianism was the next kind of chunk that you covered.
Yeah. So if you don't have essences, or especially human nature, and the way that human beings are supposed to be, as Aristotle, you don't have to be a Christian. Aristotle had an objective idea of what a human person was supposed to be: virtuous. There was the form of humanness inhered in the material body of the human. It wasn't in the separate Platonic realm, but there was a trajectory, a telos for the human person, a way the human person was supposed to become, given what they were, right? But if you don't have that, then one of the ethical views that sort of emerges fairly naturally out of nominalism is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, very basically, again, is a moral theory that what makes an act or an action good is the amount of happiness or pleasure that it gives to the greatest number of people. Okay. So there's not really intrinsic right or wrongs on this view, because again, we don't have human natures that might make something intrinsically wrong or intrinsically right or good. We don't have divine commands. We don't have a divine nature. Oftentimes on a utilitarian view, so we may not have intrinsic goods and intrinsic evils. So what we do have, though, is we have a sense that if we act in certain ways, this will increase the amount of pleasure or happiness individual minds or bodies may experience. Okay, so you can kind of map things out on a pleasure versus pain calculus, right? And then the goal of the utilitarian calculus would be, and this goes back to Epicurus and others, it's nothing new. John Stuart Mill put it into one of its most robust forms. What would make any act good or bad would be, does it increase happiness and pleasure for a greater number of people than it would cause pain to a certain number of people. So the idea is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Okay, so it's a hedonistic calculation. Now, we don't need to take hedonism in its worst sense that, this is just, going out and partying every night and getting drunk and, having as many sexual dalliances as possible. I mean, there's a certain sort of moderation to this as well, because if you just went out like that, if like full, like libertine sort of lifestyle, that can cause a lot of pain, right? So there are all kinds of nuances and moderations that people have made to the kind of utilitarianism. And it's this calculus of how to sort of be happy or wind up being happy and not sad, wind up experiencing more pleasure and less pain, and so on and so forth. But it does flow out of this idea that there is no really objective way for us to be, or no objective kind of thing that we're supposed to become. And there's no intrinsic evils or intrinsic goods necessarily, because we don't necessarily have a creator who's created the world in a certain way with a particular design in mind, right? So this is sort of follows on from nominalism. And it's deeply embedded in the culture. It is really just how we tend to operate. And if we think of our political discourse, it's all aimed at trying to make people as happy as possible in this sort of very utilitarian sort of calculation, right? Although that might be changing as well. Yeah, J.D. Vance has made some advances, I think, in pushing back against certain just purely utilitarian ways of looking at moral action, but yeah,
that's
so that's
a strange challenge for public discourse, just because, I mean, again, from a Christian worldview, we obviously know that the heart of sin is self-service rather than, it's an inward focus rather than God focus. But then in kind of like post-Christian world, like it seems like the reason why a lot of these kind of deeper and almost more abstract philosophical ideas come back in is because you have to grab onto something, right? Like the sort of hard materialist, the worldview of just absolute zero moral consequences, no moral structure, no real meaning behind anything, doesn't ultimately end up being a super livable worldview.
Yeah.
So then you end up having to appeal to just whether people realize it or not. You think about all the utilitarians out there that don't even know what that word means, that wouldn't think to categorize themselves that way, but are essentially living out that structure.
Yeah, I mean, and there is a sense in which there are times when we might get pushed into moral paradoxes or complex moral issues where, there's like the famous trolley problems and all the different variations of the trolley problems. And sometimes you fall into these complex moral situations where maybe you have to run a utilitarian sort of calculus because there's no good sort of way out of the situation. So you just kind of do what's best for the majority of the people, or what is going to so I mean, all of these views I want to like and there's arguments for nominalism, a lot of contemporary ones. There's arguments for utilitarianism, and there's arguments for hedonism. And in a sense, there's a Christian argument for hedonism that, yeah, I mean, it does seem like we are geared. We cannot wish our own, we cannot wish for ourselves to be miserable. We always want to be happy. We always want to be, experience pleasure and not pain. For us, it's more like, what is the object of the desire, and what is the goal of the desire for happiness, and how do we get to it? But we wouldn't say like the pursuit of happiness is wrong or unnatural or sinful. The pursuit of happiness is actually what we are all pursuing. We're just, the Christian answer to that is the pursuit of happiness is ultimately a relationship with God, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and back to the kind of surface level topic of transgenderism, right? Like that as a motivation for pursuing it and validating it is, that is a pursuit of, happiness.
Yeah.
That is then still defying an objective reality, or
right.
So
what if in a governmental or jurisprudential system that is amenable to the idea that there are no essences, that human beings are infinitely malleable, because there's no way we actually are or are supposed to be, and in a culture then where also utilitarianism is accepted as sort of the moral framework by which we conduct our social and political business, then when you get a lot of people requesting or even demanding that laws be changed because they have a certain happiness goal, and this is what it is, Well, then if you accept philosophical foundation 1 and 2 as legit, nominalism and utilitarianism, then probably what you're going to try and do is find ways to appease or facilitate their happiness goal, which is to be a man, even though they have a female body, or to be a female, even though they have a male body. Ultimately, what is paramount there is what is going to make them happy. And if you are a culture and a government is, as Chuck Colson once said, Washington is downstream from culture, meaning politics is downstream from culture, then your political goal is going to be to try and make those people happy. And how are you going to do that? Well, maybe you can change the laws that are preventing them from carrying out that project, that hedonistic project, of which we're all on a hedonistic project, but this one has certain presuppositions that is allowing it to go off the rails, and the rest of us to scratch our heads or either stick our head in the ground and pretend like it's not happening, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's in the kind of third point on the triangle there being pragmatism. Like that's where that kind of comes in, because that's essentially the pursuit of meeting the need.
Well, then how do you do it? Yeah. Well, and pragmatism is it's an epistemic as well as a moral position. You know, epistemic would be like things that work would be indicators of what is true. I honed in on some of John Dewey's ideas about correcting problems for the sake of returning an organism to a state of equilibrium until additional problems arise. And then you use scientific method and applied science, technology to the problems to bring society back into a position of equilibrium. Whatever is like what's morally right or wrong, or this becomes almost irrelevant. What you're trying to do is manage things in a sort of instrumental sense. There are problems that the human organism, be it the individual or the group, sort of seem to come up against. They throw us into the individual person. Well, he's a pure materialist, so it would be organism. It throws the biological organism into disarray, or it throws the group into disarray. And in order to continue to propagate and even flourish as sort of biological entities, these roadblocks need to be cleared away. Whatever clears them away is good. Whatever clears away the roadblocks, to call it human flourishing, is good. That's how we determine whether or not something's a good act or not. And then the goal is to find the ways to clear the roadblocks. So whatever the process is that leads to those the clearing of those roadblocks that inhibit the organism from experiencing equilibrium and flourishing, that process is good as well. That's why you can do experiments on people, children. That's why you can use stem cells from unborn babies and whatever Francis Collins, to be honest, I'll throw that in there because we had John West on, whatever Francis Collins was doing as NIH, because it's leading to a solution. And if it's leading to a solution to a problem, then the process itself can be deemed or considered to be good. So that's why I was looking at pragmatism. That's very embedded in the Western mindset, right? That's like the scientism sort of mindset. Science will fix the problem, and whatever science can fix must be good. It must be good to do it then. So for the transgender person and his or her advocate, or its advocate, or they's advocate, whatever, again, that's the linguistic construct part there. Get people to start talking a certain way so that you have control over language, right? You need control over language. But then even the transgender essentialist is coming up against this problem of biological design, right? And that is harder to fix by just getting everybody to speak a certain way, because you're still experiencing yourself as an embodied creature with a certain kind of body that you actually don't want. So, even if you can compel via political force or propaganda, whatever, the power of suggestion has happened in so many of our churches. Even if you can compel everybody around you to say you're a woman when you have a male body, to talk as if you are a woman, even though you have a male body, you still are experiencing yourself as a male. So what you need now is you need a fix to the practical problem, the more concrete problem of the body that you have. And that's where now, with the medical technology that we have, which you can't actually turn somebody into a woman or a man, it's all cosmetic at the end of the day, but you can make it look, pretty close, right? You can make it look pretty close using the medical sciences to alter, at least now, the physical appearance of the woman trapped in the male body or the man trapped in the female body. So even the essentialist move within transgenderism, while we can say that that's a good thing, it's moving back towards at least something like objective reality of essences. Until we address the utilitarianism that's embedded in our culture, that says, well, it's good if it makes you happy, right? As well as the pragmatism, and it's good if we can do it. And now we got technology that we can do it. Until you address those issues that are really deeply embedded in the culture, we're still going to see transgenderism, and we're going to see something more than transgenderism coming down the pike.
Yeah.
Something even worse.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. I want to read through one section you give, because I want to sort of flip over to more kind of the practical, more application type of idea, like what we do with all that information. But I just want to read this. One point you said, given the analysis so far, one can make a general conclusion about the way our current system runs in America. American governance and jurisprudence operate mainly from a philosophical confluence of nominalism, utilitarian hedonism, and pragmatism. As such, our institutions function with an almost exclusive aim: to create and enforce laws tailored to maximize the amount of subjective happiness among individual members of society by solving technical problems associated with the attainment of that happiness. In a world without any eternal laws, truths, or purposes, this might be the best we could hope for. I thought that was just a good way to kind of tie that together. And then, with that in mind, so the believer certainly can look at that and say, okay, that's what we're up against right now. I like that the first kind of note you made as far as, our response and how we handle that was highlighting the danger of swinging too far in the other direction. So it's one thing to make everything subjective, kind of open up the floodgates on self-determination of what's true. And actually, I'll read what you said too. On the latter view being, the opposite, being very rigid about the objective realities that we need to appeal to. On the latter view, activity, concreteness, and embodiment can be sacrificed for a life of disengaged abstraction. This world is that of the cloistered and privileged pure thinker. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. I think that's an important note to make.
What I was trying to, the big idea that I was trying to get at in this article is, for decades now, people have been talking about the culture wars. And I'm always trying to get down to the bottom of what are the culture wars really about? Now, this is like the second deepest layer. The deepest layer of the culture wars, as we know, is spiritual. Right? It's the battle between light and dark. It's the battle between God and Satan, and over the the state of men's souls. I mean, that's the fundamental level of any conflict in this world. But I think from a philosophical standpoint, I think this is at least a reasonable proposition for this is intellectually the bedrock of the culture war. This is what's going on. We have three philosophical views that have long been held as sort of like basic tenets in the West, in the Western mind, right? And they are erroneous views, but they have so seeped down into the culture that they're just sort of assumed as the way to operate society. Okay. So the one, again, would accept all three of these, nominalism, hedonism, pragmatism, as the ways to construct our society, right? The other, a Christian worldview. Now, it can get complicated here. There are Christian nominalists, right? There's a very famous Christian nominalist, by the way, or anti-realist, whose name will go mentioned here, but we do love him for other things. There's a kind of Christian hedonism, and obviously pragmatism has its place, science and the use of technology. But realism about essences and natures, because we believe that there's a God who's created them, and then we are, things have a form or an essence and an actual design to them, and that design plays out in such a way that things have a real purpose and goals, right? Ways that they're supposed to be. That there are intrinsic moral evils and intrinsic goods, that not everything can be mapped out on a utilitarian calculus of pleasure versus pain, right? And that pragmatism, when it has its place, cannot be the only gauge for truth, right? So the opposite is a more classical worldview, right? Which, for our purposes here, we could just say would be the adoption of something like natural law thinking. All right. The recapturing of natural law, right? Which was the view of the founding fathers, the American founding fathers, were by and large natural law guys, right? So we have to sort of find our way back to a theory of natural law that is accepted in our academic institutions, that is promoted and endorsed, and then again begins to inform and shape the way we construct our institutions, right? So that now what I was trying to point out with, if you go too far in either of these directions, if you go too far in the direction of these contemporary philosophical presuppositions, you get into this world of pure politics. We constantly are just trying to find political solutions and technological solutions to maximize the individual pleasure of the greatest number of people in this society. Doesn't matter what that pleasure is. We don't care, but that's what they want. And as I even referenced Anthony Kennedy's pronouncement, or what's called his mysterious, I think what Scalia called his mysterious maxim, in, I forget which, it was Planned Parenthood versus, can't remember which case it was, where he sort of accepts this idea of people just defining reality as they kind of desire, right? Defining their own purpose in life, their own meaning, their own realities, right? Their own project of happiness. But then you think, really? And how many people, like, how many different definitions of reality are you going to get? How many different happiness projects do you get? And how is the government and the courts, how are they going to keep up with it all? Are you really going to be able to, how are you going to be able to, I mean, one thing you could do, and this may be coming, we have to do another, is you hook everybody into what Aldous Huxley called the soma, in Brave New World. You hook everybody up into the machine and you pump them, with the experiences. It's like, not Running Man. What was that other Schwarzenegger movie? Oh my gosh. Total Recall, where, use technology, you plug everybody into the machine and the machine just pumps everybody the experiences that they desire. It's just like the pleasure machine, Robert Nozick's experience machine. Well, you could go for that. That's getting there. And actually this relates to, well, and this relates to what I end on, which is what we got coming down the pike is something far worse than transgenderism, is transhumanism, right? Okay. Now the opposite of that is that we sort of just get into the realm of thinking about universals and essences, and it becomes very abstract, and we stop our involvement in politics and the nitty-gritty of social life completely. And we just sort of contemplate eternal truths, which is great to do. I mean, Plato thought that's the end goal, is to contemplate eternal truths, right? But as Christians, we want to be equally involved in the process of engaged in the world, not of it, but engaged in the world. That means doing politics, right? But not to the abandonment of what are the universal metaphysical and moral truths that exist regardless of time, regardless of cultural conditions, regardless of individual psychologies, right? So understanding and always trying to understand more deeply the truths of God, but then also working in the world to sort of see as best we can those truths embedded in our political and jurisprudential, our legal institutions, so that we will not construct a perfect society, but we can at least hopefully construct a better society than if we abandon those truths.
Yeah, not making the mistake of thinking that the only way for things to be going well is for it to just follow biblical law to a T. Because, I mean, I guess it depends on where you live. If you live in a country where that's the idea, then I guess you submit to your local leadership in a sense. But at least in the U.S., it's not.
Yeah.
Our goal can't be to just make it look. You can vote your conscience, but the goal can't be just that, well, this is all bad until all the laws just reflect exactly what it says in the Bible, because that's...
Yeah. Well, and there's an internal debate that we have, and some other podcasts we've talked about, between whether or not, when we're talking about constructing our political and legal institutions, should we be constructing them as explicitly Christian political and legal institutions, or as institutions grounded in natural law, which is basically what we garner as human beings from general revelation and not necessarily from special revelation as found in the Bible, but general revelation is found in the created order. And what I was going for here in this is just general natural law as derived from mankind's observations from nature, as we see in the Bible, in various places in the Bible, that whether it's Proverbs or whatever, where we get sort of like wisdom, what we would call wisdom literature, right? That we can know some truths apart from the special revelation of God is given to us in the scriptures. So that's what I was going for here, that would return us in a sense to the principles of the founding fathers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. And another piece being, you've hinted at a couple times, obviously, there's sort of a twofold acknowledgement that needs to be made, at least by Christians, in that what's coming next is arguably worse than something like transgenderism. But then at the same time, there's almost a strange comfort in knowing that the philosophical assumptions behind it are the same.
Are basically the same.
Yeah. And where that put my head was, every generation's desire to treat its own, at least within the church, as the worst one. People want to talk about how surely Jesus is coming back soon now, because look at how crazy things are out there. But, if you know your history at all, most of that stuff is like, well, this was stuff that's happening now was being done a while ago and several cycles before that. But what it put in mind for me, at least as far as kind of application for the churchgoer, was just using this as a reminder, not just of the fact that these are not new ideas, but also that it focuses our efforts more on the foundation of the problem rather than just the surface level thing itself. I think some of the best theological discourse about current events is not so focused on exactly what happened from one event and extrapolating that out to mean something about the culture, but rather inverting that and saying, okay, what are the assumptions that are going on, or what are the assumptions that people are making behind these decisions? And is this actually a trend that's reflecting a fundamental shift in what people care about? Now, what you're saying is obviously there has been a very long-term shift toward a more subjective view of kind of determining reality and making decisions.
Yeah.
But you're not going to see that on the surface level.
The way I put it is a shift. It's not new.
Okay.
I mean, none of this is, you're right. None of this is new. And one of the ongoing projects I've had in my life is reading over and over again history of philosophies, right? And the more history of philosophy books or series you read, the more you'll realize there's really, it seems only a finite set of ideas that human beings ever come up with. And it's just which one is prominent at a given time, which one is sort of in controlling the minds of people at a given time. But you're going to find nominalism, obviously, you're going to find hedonism and you're going to find all these views in ancient philosophy, maybe not as articulated as in later philosophical works, but they're there. And the reason they're there is because ultimately the deepest foundation of all this is a spiritual battle, is this ongoing spiritual conflict. So you can see how something like this confluence of nominalism, utilitarianism, and pragmatism relate to something like, so one of the guys we've had on a couple of times, Carl Teichert, at the introduction to his book, Game of Gods, he says mankind basically has three goals. One, to be like God, right? Two, to be the master of meaning and purpose, and three, to live forever. Okay. And you could take that confluence of these three philosophical, and you could start to see how these are sort of the intellectual, the intellectual models that are being proposed for the sake of getting to these deeper spiritual desires, right? I mean, can we construct our own meaning and purpose? I mean, if we can, we're basically like the logos. We are the logos, right? We're the designers, not, we're the creators, not the creator, right? Pragmatism. Can we solve the problem of longevity. God says it's first and foremost, like in the here and now, it's through procreation of children, right? And then eternal life comes with the repairing of the relationship between us and God through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But can we do it otherwise? Is there a technology that we can develop to give ourselves eternal life, right? And so on and so forth. So these philosophical and intellectual, again, man suppresses the truth and unrighteousness. Once you start suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, you still have to solve the curses that come in Genesis 3 after the fall from grace. Alienation from God. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, can we be like him? Alienation from each other, right? That's political theory. That's like Marxism, right? Is an attempt, like, how do we solve the problem of being alienated from each other? And alienation from like our work, our labor, or nature, right? So we're still trying to solve those, answer the curses, come up with their own solutions to the curses. And so kind of went off on a tangent there, but so the foundational problem is still spiritual. We understand that, but there is intellectual work that Christians can and always have done, right? So there's the direct route, which is just people convert and come back to God, and then we can just live in accordance with the scriptures and in accordance to God's design. But the church has always been involved in the philosophical project, the one layer above that, right? It's always been involved in the philosophical project as well, and responding with arguments at the level of the intellect. So we need to engage there as well, and continue to do so.
Yeah, and one of the best uses of, a piece like you wrote here, at least, is bringing the individual believer back to thinking on that level. I mean, you'll still see kind of offhand comments here or there from people about, well, why do you believe this? Well, that's because what the Bible says, because God told us to do that. But there's something to being winsome in an academic sense, because certainly too, if the members of the church are making an earnest effort to at least understand what's going on behind the scenes intellectually, they're a step ahead of most people outside of the church who are making these big kind of life and ideology decisions almost on a whim, or just because of their kind of social nurturing, or they're trying to counterbalance something that their parents taught them, right? So it's almost this like impulsive thing, as central as it might be to so bringing it back to transgenderism, right? You would probably find a lot of people aren't saying like, well, I think that we should be increasing rights and protections for people in transition, for example, because I am a utilitarian and I have, I've read this and I've drawn that conclusion.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that that's not important for the conversation if we're to be kind of winsome in that space. It's just, it's the challenge of finding a way to bring a kind of cold academic conversation into a very like heart-driven, feelings-driven space.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's why it's like these things are presupposed unreflectively. They're in the culture. They're assumed. Now, a lot of Christian thinking is still assumed, right? That's why social justice initiatives that are not grounded in reality can nevertheless work, because they've developed a sort of language that relates to Christian sensibilities, right? And that can be very effective on the emotions, which we're irrational creatures. So we are usually led around by our emotions and our feelings, not by our critical thinking skills and our capacity to reason well. So there's a mishmash of philosophical views here. But yeah, people are not aware of them. They just operate out of them for the most part. And it is our job to try and sort of like surface the iceberg here a little bit and say like, look, here's the tip of the iceberg. This is why things are going on. But here, here's what's under the water, right? And why it's going on. Look, there is a place for somebody to say straight up, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. I got no problem with that. But at the same time, it can't be an excuse for not doing some hard work intellectually, as the church has always done from right out the gate when Justin Martyr writes the first apology, right? And he's responding to the pagan culture that he's living in. And then you get Irenaeus and and then you get Clement of Alexandria and all the way, and eventually Augustine and so on and so forth. So we're always dealing at both levels, spiritual, which is primary, of course, but right above that is to get biblical, we should, why not point this out? It's pretty straightforward when you think about it. There's one name, there's one characteristic that Jesus, when Jesus is talking about Satan, right? That he refers to Satan as the father of, Satan's not, and this is in John, I think John's gospel. He doesn't say that Satan is the father of, sex, or that he's the father of greed, or that he's the father of violence. He says he's the father of lies. But what are lies? They're not concrete, right? They're ideas. They're false ideas. They're false beliefs, right? So we should know that a lot of our battle, and maybe most of it in a sense, is against false ideas and false philosophies, which are just compendiums of ideas, right? So the devil mainly works through bad ideas. At the level of history and society, he works through bad ideas.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's funny to be able to go into a conversation with two sort of competing threats, one being your view of your own Christianity is so overly simplistic that, if all you're talking about in your conversation with somebody is, you know what, I'm a believer, I believe this is what the Bible says is true, and I pray that you can believe that too, that person might be left with just about nothing. Yeah. Now that piece is important because it's the Holy Spirit that makes that change in the heart ultimately. But then there's also the threat of, over intellectualizing it, where then your goal is like, well, I just need the right information so I can just like prove my way into convincing somebody. But then I guess everybody sort of needs both.
Yeah.
Right.
Everybody, I think, who has done philosophy at a serious level comes to the point where they realize I'll put it this way, there's no question, there's no argument that is not a question begging at some point. In other words, every argument we make, somebody's going to come along in history and point out a flaw in the argument. And that goes for arguments for every worldview, though. That goes for arguments for atheism, for other religions, for pantheism. There's always flaws. There's always incoherencies. There's always something that doesn't fit. We understand that. If you do enough work, you realize that. So again, that's where there is always at that point also a place to say, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it, right? But again, that does not mean that just because there are for any worldview, no non-question begging arguments, that we can't make arguments that are good, that are plausible, that are better than others, and that have compelling ramifications. And who are we to say how God might use us to reach somebody? I mean, we've seen plenty of people who are intellectuals of some sort, philosophers, scientists, politicians, whatever, who through a process, the classic case in recent history is C.S. Lewis, right? Who through a process of reasoning and hearing arguments and then came to have something like a real genuine conversion, right, to Christianity. For others, it's just more, straightforward, fine. But we're not going to throw out any tools in our toolkit.
No, and there's no way to really measure why something worked for somebody, because you could have somebody that becomes a genuine Christian, and yet if you went back and gave a score to the reasons why they converted, some of it might not be that great. Like they might have made those decisions off of kind of weak. For some people have such a, it almost feels like dangerously simple, their story of coming to Christ.
I mean, look, how many people have studied conversion stories? There's no rhyme or reason to conversion stories. They're all over the place.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I walked into a church because my girlfriend said, if you don't go to church with me, we're not going to get married. I won't marry her. Something like, she gave me this ultimatum, like, this isn't going to go anywhere. I went to church. I saw Jesus. It was not
God uses that
it wasn't a rational argument. It wasn't a syllogism. It wasn't, now I love it, but okay. I just saw Jesus. There it was. Right. And had an visual and audible experience of Christ. Not because I even wanted to go to church, just because I was, trying to get, this girl to continue to date me.
Yeah. Oh man. No, but that's all of those. Yeah. Stories are a good example, and facing transgenderism or really anything else that we see a need to kind of push back against, all that stuff kind of helps set the tone for how we actually get into the conversation.
And since we're talking about transgenderism, I mean, again, the phenomenon is real. I mean, and it's been there since the beginning. It's not new, I don't think, to want to be a woman if you're a man, to feel like you are, rebel against your body. There's all kinds of things we don't like about our bodies, right? We get it. But the best thing we could do for the person with transgender ideation is to tell them the truth, and to not try and be utilitarians or pragmatists with them and say, and nominalists, and say, well, there's no real way you're supposed to be. Your body is just a social construct anyways. And we want you to be happy. Oh, and by the way, we got the chemicals and the drugs and the surgical operations now that can do that for you. Like, that's the last thing we want to do. That would be lying. And that would be, I think, being an advocate for Satan, who is the father of lies. So let's be bold. Let's tell the truth. When we're dealing with people, let's be gentle. But when we're dealing with ideologies, let's be ruthless. We need to take out these ideologies. And we should not be treating these ideologies with kid gloves. We need to take the gloves. We take the gloves off and fight these bare-fisted. So we need to do good intellectual work. And I'm not saying I've done the best intellectual work here, but I think I've tried to show that we got to continue to attack these presuppositions that are in the culture.
Well, that's just about it from us. If you have any thoughts or questions, let us know in the comments. Check the show notes or the video description for a link to the article that we discussed today, or if you'd like a deeper dive after listening to this episode. Anthony, thanks for taking the time to engage with this and help us all think through the philosophical foundations of a movement that's so significant as transgenderism is today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.